But when this says people impacted by suicidal desperation, oftentimes when I get introduced, people will just missee that. So they'll say, this is Michelle and she works with people impacted by suicidal depression. It's like in our thinking, we can't even separate the two. That's not what that means. That's not a typo. It is desperation, and we're talking about desperation. So let me tell you what we mean when we say that. 4 groups of people that we're thinking about when we think about those impacted by suicidal desperation. The first are those who are thinking about suicide. So the estimates are that 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents. So that means that in any particular group that you find yourself in of 100 people, it's statistically likely that 6 of them are thinking about suicide. If you've got a group of 20 kids, 20 students, 20 adolescents, it's statistically likely that 3 to 4 of them are thinking about suicide. And that is a total game changer. When we have this conversation, we often think suicide, while tragic, is also rare. But the truth is that suicidal thinking is a relatively common phenomenon. And so it is statistically likely that there are people in this room today who are thinking about suicide. If you're here today and you're thinking about suicide, please don't leave without talking to me. There's hope, there are people who care, there are resources that can help. So don't leave without getting the help that you need. People care about you. We need to have that conversation. Second group of people that we think about when we think about those who are impacted by suicidal desperation are those who are worried about someone who's thinking about suicide. There is currently someone in my immediate family who thinks about suicide from time to time, wondering if the world would be better off if she weren't in it. And so I'm someone who's worried about someone who thinks about suicide. This is what I do for a living, and I'm worried about someone I love who I'm not sure that I know how to help. That can be a desperate place. And the estimates are that 20% of the population is worried about someone that's thinking about suicide. So that's 1 in 5 people, which means it is statistically likely that there are people here today, other than myself, who are worried about someone who might be thinking about suicide. If you're here today and you're worried about someone who might be thinking about suicide, I hope that you leave with the tools that you need. If you don't get the tools you need, and at the end of the day, you still need more information, I will stay as long as that takes. My flight doesn't leave till 10, so I will stay as long as you need to get you what you need. Third group of people that we think about when we think about those impacted by suicidal desperation are those who have lost someone to suicide. People who have experienced death of someone they love to suicide never get over that. That is a desperation that lives with people for a lifetime. And so that's its own kind of desperation when a person feels like they can't have that conversation with the people around them. And then the fourth group of people that we think about those impacted by suicidal desperation, are those who have been suicidal in the past and have never found a way to tell their story. They live with that story as a source of shame, as opposed to a story of hope. So in suicide prevention work and suicide prevention world, if you spend any time here, you're going to hear people talk about survivors as someone who has lost a person to suicide. A survivor in suicide work in the world is someone who has experienced the death of someone they love to suicide, right? Everywhere else you go, survivor means something else, right? What does survivor mean in other places?
Experiential.
That you've had it and you no longer do, right? But in suicide prevention work, that's already taken for people who've lost someone to death, and so there's no language. We have no real language to talk about people who have been on the other side of suicidal thinking. You can hear people occasionally say, I'm a suicide attempt survivor. That's something you'll hear people say. But the reality is we don't really have language for this. And I don't think that's an accident. I think it is an interesting thing to wonder what it says about a culture when they don't even have a word for a thing. What it means is that we don't talk about it, and I think we don't talk about it on purpose. In fact, what Gary said is that Faye, who wrote Soul Shop, he was doing this work in the 90s, he had a sudden sort of experience of multiple losses all at once, and he found himself just a couple years after writing this program standing at a gun counter to buy a gun to end his own life. He got out of line, didn't buy that gun, went and checked himself into an emergency department, and he got the help he needs. He's still here. I talked to him this morning. But as he was coming out of his own suicidal thinking, he was looking around for stories of hope. How do you come out of suicidal thinking? Where are the people who have done it? How do we mentor other people through their own suicidal thinking, and where are the leaders in that? And he came up totally empty. He found that there just weren't the stories out there. We weren't having these conversations. And so he actually wrote a book, it's over there, I have it, called A Second Day, A Hopeful Journey Out of Suicidal Thinking, to start sharing his story because he thought the world needs more of that. And we have come to use that language. We talk about second day people. So second day people are people who went through a first life prior to suicidal thinking, then through the dark night of the soul, and they came out on the other side of their suicidal thinking, and are now in their second day. I carry around my own coffee mug that says, I lived to see a second day. So that's what we mean when we talk about second day people.